Alright, as we near the end of this little Stephen King thing, we're going into the last story that we're going to talk about from Everything's Eventual, which was turned into a movie that I love, and that I've loved ever since I saw it in theaters when it came out in 2007, which is 1408, obviously. And as far as the story and how Everything's Eventual has that sort of, each story either has like that preface or what comes after the story that kind of says where his head was at or where exactly he came up with the story or where it comes from or whatever. And when you read that in this one for 1408 specifically, it almost feels like a bit of a continuation of Autopsy Room 4, which is the first story in Everything's Eventual that we've talked about, where he talks about in Autopsy Room 4 how every kind of horror or suspense author should try to tackle premature burial at some point. And then he brings that back by saying that they should also at some point try to tackle the haunted hotel room sort of kind of thing, which obviously, one could argue that he has tackled with The Shining, but this one a bit more of a straightforward way is what I imagine he means by that. And yeah, there is going to be like it's kind of impossible to not make some comparisons to The Shining here and there. But the story definitely kind of stands on its own as its own completely and totally sadistic thing in the best possible way. But another thing that's really interesting about its origin is apparently it wasn't initially meant to be even a completed story. He just wanted to write one chapter for his on writing book, where he talks about basically to show off, like as an example of writing like a first draft, and then how he goes through and like edits it or rewords it or whatever. And I don't know how well you can see that, but it's really interesting that it started off as just this, but then he actually ended up growing attached to the story and wanted to make sure that he finished it. And it ended up at about 50 to 55 pages or something. And which seems relatively condensed for everything we get into the movie, but that's the thing, is I talked a lot about, especially in the Nightmares and Dreamscapes miniseries, that I was baffled by some of the choices they made in regards to what stories they chose to adapt for the screen. Because some things just kind of feel unadaptable, like Crouch End or Omni's Last Case. It was like, why would you even bother, especially with a TV budget? Because there's hardly really anything you can do that's going to expand on the story in some effective way. And 1408 is a story that was like made to be adapted to the screen, especially with how it gives just enough of a setup and it works with it enough that it's... Because in the story, especially when you're used to the movie, all happens pretty quickly. But the fact that the movie was able to take the time and expand on that, because a large fraction of the story is the scene in Olin's office before he even goes to the room. But that they were able to take this and say, basically the writers could have a field day with what happens in the room, now that they just kind of had the idea that King was going for. And then to take that idea and think of all the different ways you can expand on that. And the movie took about as many of those possible routes as it possibly could have, and made the story all the more insane for it. Because you do have stuff that's a bit more subtle in the story, because obviously with text you have a bigger advantage of being able to do stuff more subtly, like how he sees the door seems to be crooked, but also sometimes seems to not be, and he's never quite sure if he knows if what he's seeing is what he's seeing or not. And that's basically what a lot of the story is just kind of King playing with that, and the way the pictures change and tilt and all that. And what's great is a lot of that stuff is in the movie also, but the movie can also afford to go much more, kind of more broad and over the top. And some of the shit that they came up with is incredible, really. Like, it's, as far as adaptations go, I don't know how much better this could have gone. For a story that already really works on its own. But in its own way, where, like I said, it feels more suited for text, because it's a bit more subtle in what it does. But, like I said, as far as the adaptation process goes and being able to expand, this is how you do that, especially with a story like this. And when you go into the casting of John Cusack as Mike Enslin is also something that's kind of just a stroke of perfect genius, where he's got this because in the movie adds in a whole backstory for him, this whole tragic backstory that he kind of has to is kind of the foundation of his performance underlying before we really even know that kind of stuff. So at the start, he just kind of comes off at like this. There's like a smugness about him, but obviously with Cusack, he can find that sort of perfect level of smugness, which is exactly where he is for a lot of like the first half or so before his backstory kind of starts to get gradually revealed. And then when that comes in, he's able to hit those emotional beats just as well. But I'd like to get into that a bit more after we talk about kind of the setup, where like as far as setting up the tone, where he gets the mysterious postcard and then he goes to the city. And the thing about this is the score plays a huge part, I think, in the eeriness that just oozes out of this movie. And the first real glimpse I feel like we get of that is this shot of the city once he's there. And it's just this really ominous tune over the footage of the city, but it's like the hustle and bustle of the city. It's got, you know, the lights reflecting off the buildings in the night and all that stuff, and it's not really the kind of location or image that you associate with, you know, being ominous or like an almost supernatural horror kind of vibe, especially with, you know, stuff like this, like the sort of haunted house scenario. There's much more of a claustrophobic thing going on, and that's what you expect out of this, obviously, with it being mainly set in the one room. But to start it off with this image of like a full city with the full hustle and bustle of everything, and being able to set an ominous tone based off that itself, it almost feels like because the Dolphin Hotel is in this city, the whole city is haunted by association. And that really works, especially how it's sort of like when we start with a shot like that in the city, and then we get the shot of the hotel, and then we see the lobby, and then we get to the room. It's like the setting slowly becomes more and more claustrophobic the closer and closer he gets to the room until he's finally there, and then we're shut in for however long this is. And I thought that was really well done. And then you talk about Olin describing everything, which is where a lot of the horror of the story comes in. Like the backstory and him and Olin talking is almost as terrifying as when he's actually in the room when it comes to the story, and we get all the different background on what happened there and what didn't. But the thing is also is when he's talking about like the stuff by didn't I mean the stuff we don't see, like when he's talking about when they go in every like once a month and they change the beds and all that, but they do it quickly with the door open, and it's like they treat it like there's poisonous gas in the room, and it's like just hearing about stuff like that is really like, because like in the movie we get the visual of like, you know, the dead bodies and the, you know, all the aftermath of that, but just being told with no visuals whatsoever, imagining them like rushing in and out of the room trying to do their jobs and then get out, and then like the moment when Olin's on the elevator and he's like, this is as far as I go unless it's that time of the month. And just the way he says that is so just, there's something so sinister about it. And basically that whole thing kind of has this whole sort of weird force around the whole thing. And it's like, even though we're not like physically there like the way we could be, you know, reading the text and being able to visualize everything around us and every single detail that he puts in, you can still feel that. There's a line that's always stuck out to me towards the beginning, when he's at the very sparsely populated book signing, and he's talking to like his 4 fans that are there, and he's saying that while he hasn't seen a ghost, he sort of felt like supernatural essence, and he describes it as the air being thick. And it's like, that's like for any supernatural story, that line has always kind of stuck with me, and like that's how I imagine it might feel if you were actually here, because we do get, you know, detail of how everything starts to feel heavier in the story when he steps up the elevator and is getting closer to the room. But the way he describes that at the beginning of the movie kind of gives you this almost physical feel that you can imagine when you're watching everything from this point, from him getting off the elevator to getting to the room, and even while he's in the room before shit starts to get really crazy. And it just really paints itself so vividly, and that's and you've also got these little creepy touches in there, like the baby carriage that looks like way out of its era, or the flies on the food that are outside. Just everything starts to feel off the closer he gets to everything, and it's just this. Yeah, as far as setting the mood, it, like I said, I don't think could have been done much better. And then there's the whole thing about Olin himself, where it's like, because obviously in the story he seems to just be the manager that really is trying to help him and say, whatever you do, don't go in there because we've seen what happens. And I like that they kind of add an almost aggressiveness to it, and that's comes through in the casting of Samuel Jackson, which is great also. And you can tell that was definitely a choice for the character in the script, as when they describe what Olin looks like in the story, it's nothing like it. He's like fat, and it's. But the thing is that aggressiveness coming through, whether it be the famous line of "It's an evil fucking room," which just tells you everything you need to know in one line, with that perfect Samuel Jackson delivery. But there's also when he adds the whole thing of, it's not just that I want to help you, it's I don't want to be stuck cleaning up the mess, because there will be one. And it's just, as I said, all it takes is like one perfectly timed line, or perfectly written or worded line, and it just completely sends chills before you've even seen anything that's insane. And we do get some insane ass imagery here. And then there's actually some like theories about Olin, as far as like, like what is he exactly? Is he like an angel of sorts? And it's like because the question remains of who sent Mike the postcard, which is that this DVD was convenient enough to actually come with postcards that, interestingly enough, Olin is pictured on the top of. And they're just normal postcards on the other side. And the theories are like, did Olin send it to him knowing that he would, like, being some angelic force, knew that Mike would somehow beat the room? Or was it the room itself that somehow sent it to him? I always kind of took it as it was the room itself, and that's, until you've seen the movie in context, that does sound kind of dumb. But I mean, once you've seen what the room is capable of, it's like, oh yeah, the room could have done that easily. That would have been like the least weird thing this room is capable of. But yeah, like, just leading into it, though, before he's even in the room, it's just like everything feels ominous. Everything he sees feels almost like ghost-like or threatening or just generally sinister in some sort of way. But then, yes, once we're inside the room, and it basically becomes, as far as Cusack's performance goes, I talked about him doing that perfect level of smugness, and then we kind of he gets the more emotional beats just right when his backstory comes into it. But the thing that you can't ignore is once he's in the room, and even though Samuel Jackson's prominently here and is like, top billed above the title with Cusack, once he's in the room, this is basically a one-man show with Cusack. Mostly doing just dialogue to himself in the tape recorder and stuff like that. Dialogue that was really well adapted for the script, being like a lot of what, because obviously Mike does talk into the recorder in the story, but the script and for the movie actually takes some of the dialogue that wasn't said out loud, as like some of the more like descriptive words that King was using, and puts them into Mike's dialogue. And I thought that was a really good call, especially for a lot of stuff like the whole hotels are a naturally creepy place thing, where he talks about, who all was laid in the bed and who died or lost their minds or was sick or whatever. Because that was always like a really creepy way to start off. I think that's in like the preface of it, actually. And to actually put that in Mike's dialogue as he's kind of surveying everything was a really good call. And then, naturally, once everything starts to go insane, it's just building and building and building. And the great thing about this is that they take just about any possible scary thing from any sort of scary story you can think of, and it somehow shows up in this. There's, there's a technique where it's like when he's looking out the window and he sees the dude out there and he thinks he has help, but then the guy starts making the same motions as him. Then it's revealed the dude actually is him, in a way, and then Crazy Hammer Guy comes up behind him, and that's that thing where you think when he sees that across in the reflection, or whatever you want to call it, when he turns around, all cliche and all anything you've ever seen in a horror story before tells you there's not going to be anything there. So when Crazy Hammer Guy is there, that is like a massive moment in this movie. It is like one of the ultimate memorable scares, not just in this movie, but maybe of the horror movies of that decade, from 2000 to 2009. It's and every time the dude comes back, he manages to get a scare, and he's only there like maybe twice, 2 or 3 times. The third time he's in the painting, and he's still effective as just a still image. But then you also have stuff like just old-fashioned ghosts are in this, which, if they had come too early, would probably look a bit silly and out of place. But the fact that they're just kind of in the middle of all the chaos is what makes it work so well, and just adds this whole, it's like almost sort of old-fashioned creepy aspect to it. And then you've got the stuff where it just goes completely off. Like, he mentions that it's Kafka-esque later in the movie, when it's like, it's able to just kind of, the room is basically able to restructure itself, seemingly, where he's out on the ledge, and of course we talked about how great King handles ledges, despite the fact that it's not even in the story. It almost feels like there's a few sort of intentional callbacks to previous King adaptations that are in the movie. There's also like the scene at the very end of Misery, when Paul sees Annie coming supposedly in the restaurant, and it's like, that's kind of like when he sees the woman that appears to be the ghost when he thinks he's out of the room. And of course, all the Shining stuff. There's a lot that kind of feel like sort of King Easter eggs, I guess you want to call it, as much as I hate the term. But all of that, but then you also have the stuff, and you have the claustrophobia coming into it also. But then there's the whole thing of just the cruelty of the room, and how it builds, like when he says that it's evil, we just kind of imagine that there's a lot of crazy shit in there. Another thing is, we kind of get a sense towards the beginning of the guy in the vent, before we start getting closer up to him, and just that little like moment where we get a sense of him suddenly makes you feel like there's something looming above through the rest of the movie until he's actually in the vent. And that's something that just kind of works in this sort of subtle way. But then, yeah, evil also totally and completely referring to just the cruelty that this room has, because, now talking about the backstory is, usually that would seem like some device, like I've talked about it before in these adaptations, where it's like, sometimes they add more to a family backstory, and you can just tell it's like them trying to kind of pad the runtime a little bit, or to get it to the length of a short story to the length of a feature-length movie or a TV episode that's about an hour. But here, the great addition of having Mike's ex-wife, his ex-wife is mentioned like once in the story in passing, because she got him the tape recorder, and that's about it as far as I remember. But to add in the story of he's kind of reconnecting with her once he's in the city now, and then they've got the daughter that got sick and died and all that, and he had a dad that got sick and died, and bringing all that family aspect into it is, not only does it just add to the cruelty of the room using that stuff to like taunt him, but there's also just the emotional impact that it has. When you put that sort of emotion into it, and you see how that's like pretty much at its core, and that's where he's coming from as a character, it's like it's almost sneaking in character development and emotion, because a lot of these scenes are used as either they just seem like they're the generic backstory thing, or they're used to kind of further the horror, like the scene where he envisions his dad. But it's like, once that emotion and character is established without you hardly even realizing it, when the room starts getting more and more cruel, the horror of it is going to hit significantly harder and feel like visceral in nature. Like the moment towards the end when he realizes he's back in the room. That's a whole brilliant development, by the way, also, is the whole take this whole middle portion and have him and the audience convinced that he's out, only to reveal that he has never been. Is that was I remember the first time I saw that scene. That was so fucking nuts, and it's such an amazing mid-movie twist. But it does pretty much take us into the end. But then it takes us to this scene when his daughter comes out, and it's sort of like adult Bill and It seeing Georgie in the sewer, where he knows, that that's not who it's supposed to be, and that's not his loved one, and he's immediately trying to come to terms with that to beat it, but he's falling into the trap. And when there's two layers to how fucked up this is. Because it starts with him having to watch her die. Like, he obviously, abandoned them, but then now this is his chance to really watch her die. Like, the room wants him to see that happen. And if that's not enough, the way she, explodes and collapses into nothingness in his arms is so... So when they adapted this, they had such a sadistic streak that works so well with the room and what exactly it is that it does. And that's another thing I didn't mention also was the alarm clock, and the fact that they've now added that it ramps up the suspense that you feel like there is a clock ticking down. And then the whole thing of when this hour runs out, it's like, can he beat the hour? And once he does beat the hour, and it seems like he's back to where it was, and he can probably just walk out the door. Before he can even get off the ground, the clock just resets itself, and we realize this is just going to be a loop forever, unless he kills himself with the conveniently placed noose that the room left him. And there's even stuff that does come over straight from the story, like the weird shit that is being said to him over the phone. And it's like, and you see that in the movie, it sounds almost weirdly nonsensical. But then when you read the story, you realize there's no other context. It's just that. And that's the reason I praise The Shining so much, is there's no real explanation. The whole thing just is, because that's what it is and what it does. And it's just it doesn't matter what it is or where it comes from. All that matters is if the protagonist is going to get out of it or not. And that's always really powerful, especially in horror, when they don't get too wrapped up in what is it. Because that's the scary thing, is that it just is. So, yeah. And then there is the alternate endings. There's only one I'm really familiar with, but I hear there's a bunch, I guess. So, for the uninitiated, apparently, the ending that I've always known, that is the ending that was the ending when I saw it in theaters, and is the ending when you choose the theatrical version on this DVD, is when he gets out and he and his wife seem to reconnect, and he's written or rewritten the story depending on when he was out of the room. And then when he plays the tape recorder, he hears his daughter's voice on it, and they both hear it, and that's it. And apparently there's one ending where he hears it and she doesn't. But then there is one particular ending that apparently doesn't work for a lot of people, which is it goes to Olin, and it ends up that Mike actually dies in the room. And as far as I remember, it's vague, but Olin goes to the cemetery, and then there's a jump scare where he sees Mike burned in his rearview mirror, and that's pretty much what the end is. And I have a friend in Australia that lives in Australia, and I had recommended him a bunch of movies, and this was one of them. And after he watched it, he got back to me, and he was like, it was fine, I just didn't care for the ending. I was like, really? Because I thought the ending was pretty effective. I like the theatrical ending quite a bit, actually. And then he said something about a jump scare. I think something tipped me off that the ending he saw was not the ending that I know. And I was like, wait a minute, did your ending involve a cemetery? And apparently that's the ending that's attached to a lot of versions of it. So I don't. So like the most widely seen ending is the one that wasn't. I don't know. But the ending I've always been used to is the one where they both hear the daughter's voice on the tape recorder. So, and I always thought that that ending worked quite well. And I remember not particularly caring for the alternate ending when I saw it. The one in the cemetery particularly. Like I said, I don't even know how many alternate endings there are. I think there's like 5 or something. But yeah, so overall, as you have seen, I really, really love this movie quite a bit. It still scares the ever-living shit out of me. And it's no matter what time of day you watch it, which is great. And like I said, it's just so visceral in its hatred. And it's like much like it, you could probably say, that it feels like a unique story despite having a very classic like approach, like a classic setup. And like I said, as far as adaptations go, and taking the great concept that King had going in the book and be able to expand on it this much, and really bring out just how evil the room is, has always been incredibly effective to me. And of course, would not be near as effective if not for Cusack's incredible, like, fucking powerhouse performance. This is probably one of the best performances of his career. And in a movie like this. So, though you'd be surprised how many, like, incredible, like, top-tier performances come from horror movies. Quite a bit, actually, when you look back on it. But, yes, so I just love this all around. So, I guess we will leave this at this, so that leaves 4 more of these, and then we'll be done. And then we'll continue. The reviews are going to kind of start gradually coming back, like The King of Staten Island, The Five Bloods, and Artemis Fowl will have its own video, and then there'll be another one that's like a whole bunch of shit to kind of catch up. And me and my brother will still be doing verses a couple of times a week. So, yeah, so we'll still be going at a pretty steady pace regardless of what's going on. So, until all of this stuff coming, I think that's it.